We come to the statement. I call the Secretary of State, Michael Gove.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And with your permission, I'd like to make a statement about the next steps that we are taking in the government's strategy to counter extremism and to build greater national resilience and social cohesion. The United Kingdom is a success story, a multinational, multi-ethnic, multi-faith democracy, stronger because of our diversity. But our democracy and our values of inclusivity and tolerance are under challenge from extremist groups which are radicalising our young people and driving greater polarisation within and between communities to further their own ends. In order to protect our democratic values and enhance social cohesion, it is important both to reinforce what we all have in common and to be clear and precise in identifying the dangers posed by extremism. As our new definition makes clear, extremism can lead to the radicalisation of individuals, deny people their full rights and opportunities, suppress freedom of expression, incite hatred, weaken social cohesion, and ultimately it can lead to acts of terrorism. Most extremist materials and activities are not illegal and do not meet a terrorism or national security threshold. For example, Islamist and neo-Nazi groups in Britain are operating lawfully, but they advocate and work towards the replacement of democracy with an Islamist or Nazi society. The Department for Levelling Up Housing in Communities has been working with local authorities, civil society and faith groups, especially in those areas where social cohesion is most under strain, to de-escalate tensions and to explore the most constructive support that we can offer. From our engagement, we hear widespread unease over the safety and security of community organisations, political candidates and elected officials. Councillors have been threatened with violence. Council meetings have been disrupted. Council officers and elected members talk of walking a tightrope, terrified of inadvertently saying the wrong thing, of offending one side or another. Many choose to remain silent, to take no action. Mr. Speaker, such is the chilling effect of these extremist groups on our democracy. It is, of course, gravely concerning that the conflict in the Middle East is driving further polarisation. We've seen a terrible increase in anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim hate crime, as well as a very significant increase in radicalisation. Troublingly, there is also evidence that some Islamists and extreme right-wing groups and others who seek to tear our society apart are working together to maximise the reach of their message and cause. And that is why the work of civil society organisations such as the Community Security Trust and Tel Mama, as well as Muslims Against Anti-Semitism, the educational charity Solutions Not Sides, and the Forum for Discussion of Israel and Palestine is so important. We've provided additional funding for the CST and Tel Mama to counter anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hatred, and we will do more. We will shortly establish a new fund to provide additional, direct and tangible support for grassroots organisations building bridges and fighting division. I wish to commend those doing so much to counter prejudice. In working with civil society, it's critically important that we do not, unwittingly or through ignorance, fund or otherwise support organisations or individuals who are themselves extremist. In the past, it has unfortunately been the case that extremist groups and actors have sought to present themselves as moderate voices, representative of majority or mainstream opinion. The government has had a definition of extremism since 2011. It has helped inform our prevent counter-terrorism work and was designed to assist the government in engagement. But in a considerable number of cases, organisations and individuals with views which are clearly extreme have nevertheless benefited from state engagement, endorsement and support, and furthermore have exploited that association to further their extremist agendas. Among the most significant was Shakil Beg, who was labelled an Islamist extremist by a judge. Mr. Beg, an NHS chaplain and regular speaker at state schools, ran the Lewisham Islamic Centre and was on both the Metropolitan Police's Independent Advisory Group in Lewisham and Lewisham's Standing Advisory Committee on Religious Education. In 2016, Mr. Beg sued the BBC when they described him, accurately, as an extremist. The judge in the case, Mr. Justice Haddon Cave, conducted his own scrupulous research, identifying many occasions where Mr. Beg had advocated extreme positions, including promoting and encouraging religious violence, by telling a Muslim audience that violence in support of Islam would constitute a man's greatest deed. Not only did Mr. Justice Haddon Cave dismiss Mr. Begg's claim, he drew specific attention to the danger of extremists exploiting sponsorship from state institutions. And he outlined the need for an updated and more precise definition of extremism to guide engagement by government and others. And we have since seen how figures of potential extremism concern have been able to work with the Crown Prosecution Service and the Metropolitan Police, co-opt charities, and indeed benefit from public funding. And we know from William Shawcross's excellent independent review of Prevent that such engagement has inadvertently provided a platform, funding, or legitimacy for groups or individuals who oppose our shared values. This apparent legitimising of their views can lead extremists of all ideologies to be emboldened and to exert greater influence. That's why today my department is publishing an updated, more precise and rigorous definition of extremism, alongside a set of cross-government engagement principles for use when engaging with external groups. There is also detailed guidance on what the definition does and does not capture. And we're also setting up a new counter-extremism centre of excellence in my department as a world-leading authority on best practice, data and research. Mr. Speaker, our plans, drawn up in close collaboration with the Home Office, will enable the government to express more clearly than ever before which groups fall within the extremism definition, and we can point to the evidence and explain the funding and engagement consequences. They will also support national efforts to counter the work of extremists who promote their ideologies both online and offline. The new definition will strengthen vital frontline counter-radicalisation work, and the new Centre of Excellence will also help us to understand the role played by state actors and state-linked organisations in extremist activity which is taking place in our country. And the wider knowledge of what constitutes extremist behaviour and who is behind it will, I hope, help all of us to identify potential threats and to take steps to challenge and marginalise them. Critically, the rights that we enjoy in the United Kingdom extend to everyone. Freedom of expression, freedom of religion and belief, the rule of law, upholding democracy and equal rights, these are the cornerstones of our civilised society, which as a government, as a parliament, on every side of this House, we strive always to uphold. So let me be clear, our definition will not affect gender-critical campaigners, those with conservative religious beliefs, trans activists, environmental protest groups, or those exercising their proper right to free speech. The government has taken every possible precaution to strike a balance in drawing up the new definition between protecting fundamental rights and safeguarding citizens. Our definition draws on the work of Dame Sarah Khan, the government's independent reviewer of social cohesion, and Sir Mark Rowley, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, before his appointment to that post. The proposed definition will hold that extremism is the promotion or advancement of an ideology based on violence, hatred or intolerance that aims to negate or destroy the fundamental rights and freedoms of others, or undermine, overturn or replace the UK system of liberal parliamentary democracy and democratic rights, or intentionally create a permissive environment for others to achieve these results. It is important to stress that we are in no way intending to restrict freedom of expression, religion or belief. But the government cannot be in a position where, unwittingly or not, we sponsor, subsidise or support in any way organisations and individuals opposed to the freedoms we hold dear. Across this House, I am sure that we would agree that organisations such as the British National Socialist Movement and Patriotic Alternative, who promote neo-Nazi ideology, argue for forced repatriation, a white ethno-state and the targeting of minority groups for intimidation, are precisely the type of groups about which we should be concerned and whose activities we will assess against the new definition. The activities of the extreme right wing are a growing worry. The targeting of both Muslim and Jewish communities and individuals by these groups is a profound concern requiring concerted action. And it is important, just as with our definition of extremism, to be precise in the use of language when discussing Islamism. Islamism should never be confused with Islam. Islam is a great faith, a religion of peace, which provides spiritual nourishment to millions, inspires countless acts of charity, and celebrates virtues of generosity, compassion, and kindness. Islamism is a totalitarian ideology which seeks to divide, calls for the establishment of an Islamic state governed by Sharia law, and seeks the overthrow of liberal democratic principles. It has its roots in the thinking of the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hassan al-Banna, the founder of Jamaat-e-Islami, Abu al-Maududi, and the Muslim Brotherhood ideologue, Said Qutb. The Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood is, of course, Hamas. Organisations such as the Muslim Association of Britain, which is the British affiliate of the Muslim Brotherhood, and other groups such as Cage and MEND, give rise to concern for their Islamist orientation and views. We will be holding these and other organisations to account to assess if they meet our definition of extremism, and will take action as appropriate. There are, of course, further steps that we will take in the coming days and weeks to marginalise extremist groups and to support and strengthen those communities where extremists are most active and spreading division. This will include responding to Dame Sarah Khan's forthcoming report on social cohesion and democratic resilience, and Lord Walney's independent review of how to counter political violence and disruption. In this debate, we must never forget about the experiences of victims of extremism who are targeted by extremist groups and the severe and distressing impact it has on their lives. So I'm pleased that Dame Sara Khan will be addressing this in her forthcoming report. As the Prime Minister has said, the time has come for us all to stand together to combat the forces of division and to beat this poison. The liberties that we hold dear, and indeed the democratic principles we're all sent here to uphold, require us to counter and challenge the extremists who seek to intimidate, to coerce and to divide. We have to be clear-eyed about the threat we face, precise about where that threat comes from, and rigorous in defending our democracy. That means upholding freedom of expression, religion and belief when they are threatened, facing down harassment and hate, supporting the communities facing the greatest challenge from extremist activity, and ensuring this House and this country are safe, free and united. I commend this statement to the House.
I now call the Shadow Secretary of State, Angela Rayner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by thanking the Secretary of State for advance sight of this statement and for his briefing yesterday. Hateful extremism threatens the safety of our communities and the unity of our country. Everyone across this House can agree that this is a serious problem which demands a serious response. So I want to begin by saying from the outset, when it comes to our national security, when it comes to the threat of radicalisation, when it comes to the toxic scourge of Islamophobia, neo-Nazism, anti-Semitism or any other corrosive hatred, the whole House can and should work together. The way the government does this work matters, and the language that we all use is important. And I want to welcome the Secretary of State's opening words that it is our diversity and our values which make our country stronger. Indeed, the Secretary of State is right to raise the concerns about the dangers facing our elected representatives. We must be free to represent the views of our constituents. We all have a responsibility to work to extinguish the flames of division and never to fan them. While it may be part of the nature of our politics for passion to sometimes take centre stage, and while we may challenge and probe these plans today, if the Secretary of State wants to engage going forward, he has my word that we can do so in good faith. And the reason that I say challenge is because I do believe he's made a mistake in the way that this policy has been trailed in the last week. So I'm glad that he's now come to the House to give clarification. But it is not right that we have spent the last few days poring over a possible new definition in the papers. And it's not right that the Department has leaked the names of groups that may or may not be covered by this definition when he rightly says this work should be based on due diligence. And it is not right that each stage of the recruitment of a new Islamophobia advisor has been mired in controversy. So can the Secretary of State confirm he has now appointed an advisor? So on today's announcement, Mr. Speaker, we will scrutinise this new definition, and it will be crucial to see the way it is applied in practice. But can I ask the Secretary of State to set out today how the new Centre of Excellence will operate and how it will be resourced? And can he confirm how this new definition will work in practice? How exactly will it restrict the government's engagement? And can you explain whether these restrictions will only relate to government engagement or later extended to other public bodies such as the police and universities? Given this new definition, the public will rightly be alarmed at the idea that government ministers could already have met with extremist groups. Can the Secretary of State shed some light on this? Renewed vigilance and diligence is welcome, particularly in the current climate, but if his own department now needs to cut ties with extremist groups, it begs the question why they were working with them in the first place. And given he says this will not affect gender-critical campaigners, those with conservative religious beliefs, trans activists, environmental protest groups or those exercising their proper right to free speech, can the Secretary of State explain which groups this new definition will affect and where the government has chosen to draw the line? Mr. Speaker, this is not the first time that the government has identified this risk or promised to act. As the Secretary of State mentions in his opening, at the beginning of 2011, well back then, the Conservative Home Secretary told the House that if organisations do not support the values of democracy, human rights, equality before law, participation in society, we will not work with them and we will not fund them. It begs the question, why has it taken the government 13 years to address this? The Secretary of State says that organisations which are clearly extreme have benefited from government engagement, endorsement and support, and even suggests that those groups have exploited government engagement. Can he understand how deeply concerning this is to hear? He must explain exactly how this has been allowed to happen. Mr. Speaker, we know that there has been a huge surge in online extremism, and can the Secretary of State give assurance on how this will be dealt with? What action he is taking to work cross-government to assess and confront online hate? We know that extremism doesn't exist in a vacuum, and we need political leadership on this. But a quality of good leadership is to empower others. The Secretary of State says that the Department has been working with faith groups, civil society and local councils, and I agree that they all have a crucial role to play in tackling extremism. But what form has that consultation taken, and will he publish the findings of that consultation? And on the wider work now needed, can the Secretary of State set out if this work will be underpinned by a new cross-government counter-extremism strategy, given the last one is now 9 years out of date? Will it include action to rebuild the resilience and cohesion of our communities? And he mentions new funding. How much will that funding be, and how will it be allocated? And how will it interact with other funding streams, including the multi-faith dialogue? Mr. Speaker, I also want to raise the point about hate crime and how important this is to tackling extremism. We have seen an appalling surge of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in recent months, and the previous strategy is now 4 years out of date. Can I ask the Secretary of State, when will he have an updated hate crime action plan? And have ministers abandoned plans to bring forward a new hate crime strategy? And can I ask the Minister, why is the Anti-Muslim Hatred Working Group and the Anti-Semitism Working Group no longer meeting? We need much stronger action to tackle the corrosive forms of hatred that devastate lives and corrode communities. But today's statement does not go far enough. And regardless of how workable and effective this new definition and centre of excellence is, this announcement will not be enough. I want to finish by echoing the words of the Archbishops of Canterbury and York and their warnings that against the backdrop of growing divisions, it is for political leaders to provide a conciliatory tone and to pursue policies that bring us together, not risk dividing us apart. I look forward to working with the Secretary of State on this.
Secretary of State.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Shadow Secretary of State for the constructive, detailed and consensual approach that she's taking to what are inevitably challenging and difficult issues. I enjoyed the opportunity to talk to her and other Labour colleagues yesterday. I look forward to working together in the future, and I know it is the role of the opposition to challenge, and the constructive way in which challenge has been issued today is something which I wholeheartedly welcome. Can I also say that I agree with the Shadow Secretary of State that the danger to elected representatives is growing, and it is something which my right honourable friend, the Security Minister, has invested time, care and money to counter. And can I also say, of course, passion, vigour, determination is part of the meat of our politics, and nothing in anything that we have said today should take away from our desire to see free speech exercised as energetically as possible. The Shadow Secretary of State mentioned the leaking of some information relating to our work on this. I deprecate that leaking. It is fundamentally a challenge to the effective operation of government, and a leak inquiry has been commissioned in order to see how some of the information about our statement today was shared. But, Mr. Speaker, there is an opportunity for all of us, as a result of my having given the statement, to scrutinise the detail. The Shadow Secretary of State talks of the Centre of Excellence, how it will be staffed, how it will be funded. Impartial civil servants with training in this area will be supplemented in their work by studies by academics and academic bodies. And of course, we will work with the existing expertise in the Homeland Security Analysis and Intelligence Unit within the Home Office in order to ensure that all our work is rigorous. And we will make sure that if a decision is made to list an organisation as extremist, that we will show our working, as it were, that the evidence which leads us to that conclusion and the judgment that we have made will be there for everyone to see. The Shadow Secretary of State asked, of course, why it was the case that in the past, government or arms of the state had unwittingly involved themselves or been engaged with extremist organisations. It's because the definition, while well-intentioned and drawn up with care, was perhaps insufficiently precise and perhaps insufficiently policed, that we thought it was appropriate to update that definition. And this follows on, of course, from the Shakil Beg case, from William Shawcross's independent review of Prevent, and other examples that were brought to government's attention. And I think the real sin would be, having been told by independent figures, by the courts, and by William Shawcross, that we needed to look again at our approach. The real sin, I think, would have been not to, and to have stuck to a course which had led to mistakes in the past. And of course, the Shadow Secretary of State asks about wider work on resilience. We'll be publishing a more detailed action plan which will include funding commitments to support organisations on the ground which do build up a greater degree of community resilience, and I look forward to working with her and others in local government to achieve that valuable end.
Clerk of the House, Sir Peter Bottom.
I'm glad to follow both the previous frontbench speakers, who I think have given a lead to the House. There's an interesting question. When, 90 years ago, would it have been right to identify Oswald Mosley and his approach, not just as politicians, but as people marching through streets to intimidate people, as a threat, and why it took so long more recently, when Kathleen Stock was at Sussex, that the Students' Union and many others called her a dangerous extremist for writing a rather good book and having views which are now mainstream. It seems to me that filling in the gap between what's not necessarily criminal but should be identified as wrong is an important thing, and I hope the whole House can give support to the proposals today.
I'm very, very grateful to the Father of the House. There should rightly be a high bar on the use of criminal sanctions. We should seek to encourage free speech always, but he is quite right to draw attention to the freedom-restricting harassment that some have engaged in, and I completely endorse the point that he makes about Kathleen Stock, a distinguished academic.
SNP spokesperson Alison Poulos.
I would first like to wish Ramadan Mubarak to everybody who is marking this significant month in the Islamic calendar. Friday is also International Day to combat Islamophobia, but it's in this context that Muslims are afraid to speak out lest they be targeted for their beliefs or indeed labelled extremists themselves. The government's independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, Jonathan Hall, has said that these proposals by the government could undermine the UK's reputation because it would not be seen as democratic. Others, including the Archbishops of Canterbury and York, have said that, crucially, the new definition risks disproportionately targeting Muslim communities who are already experiencing rising levels of hate and abuse, and said that new definition risks vilifying the wrong people. Zahra Mohammed of the Muslim Council of Britain is also very concerned by the government's proposals, concerned that they are undemocratic, divisive and potentially illegal. The organisation is also concerned by the lack of engagement with some of the groups that the Minister comes here to talk about today. So I ask him when any of the Muslim groups that he mentioned specifically contacted so that they would know that they are in the Minister's statement today. There has been a desperately worrying increase in Islamophobia and in anti-Semitism since the 7th of October. It should concern us all that this is happening. We stand against extremism. We stand against the targeting of groups in our society. But this extremism is on the rise, driven in no small part by the culture wars stoked by the Conservatives and their hangers-on, by those who would call peace demonstrations hate marches. And also, as we have heard this week, racism and misogyny by funders of the party of government. Can I ask him if he considers that racism and misogyny meet his definition of extremism, and if he believes that the statement by Frank Hester of Diane Abbott, "You want to hate all black women because she's there, I think she should be shot," would meet his definition of extremism. Well, if he does believe it meets a definition of extremism, will his party return the £10 million, or will he donate it to a charity of Diane Abbott's choosing?
Hear, hear.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for the points that she makes, and she is quite right to say that we need to be precise, and it is important, as I stressed in my statement, but have the opportunity to stress again, not to conflate the specific challenge from certain Islamist groups with the broader Muslim community. It's absolutely because we need to be precise in order to draw that distinction that we are then able to support organisations on the ground that are seeking to bring people together and to counter anti-Muslim hate and anti-Semitism. Can I also thank her and her colleagues in the Scottish Government for the engagement that we undertook earlier this week through the Interministerial Standing Committee in order to share best practice about how we work with groups on the ground across the United Kingdom who are engaged in this vital counter-extremism work. She refers, of course, to the comments by a gentleman not in this House. Those comments were clearly racist and regrettable. And speaking as someone who was himself targeted by an extremist who was attempting to kill me and who then went on to murder a colleague and friend in this House, I take that sort of language incredibly seriously.
Chair of the Security Committee, Sir Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Surely the essential point here is that the government is not proposing to ban any organisation, however extreme, from operating legally and within the law, rather to identify those organisations that should be barred from receiving funding or other support from the government. Now, the government hasn't shared with the Intelligence and Security Committee its proposals, so any point I make now is purely personal to me. But does the Minister agree with me that in any democratic society there is a right to decide which bodies you will associate with and which you won't? And that is why the Labour Party was quite right to ban no fewer than 7 extreme left organisations since July 2021 from being compatible with Labour Party membership in accordance with values as defined, quite properly, by its own National Executive Committee.
Well, I thank my right honourable friend, who has a very distinguished record in this area, and he is absolutely right. There is appropriately a very high threshold for the prescription of organisations, one which his career recently met. We are not seeking to ban or to restrict the operation of these organisations in a free society. We are simply making clear that it would be wrong for government to use taxpayers' money or public endorsement in engagement with these organisations.
Chair of the Committee, Dame Diana Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, in the statement, the Secretary of State refers to our definition draws on the work of Dame Sarah Khan, the Government's independent reviewer of social cohesion, and Sir Mark Rowley, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, before his appointment to that post. In the Home Affairs Select Committee report on the policing of protests, we said this: we find it surprising that the Government have not yet responded to the reports it commissioned from the Commissioner for Countering Extremism regarding hateful extremism, particularly the report Operating with Impunity by Dame Sarah Khan and Sir Mark Rowley. And Sir John Saunders, in his report in 2023, rightly said that the Home Office should respond as a matter of urgency. I'm just wondering, from what's happened today and this moving away from Home Office to DLUC, whether whether the Minister has had any conversations with the Home Office about whether there will be a full response to what Dame Sarah Khan's report set out, and also how this new definition will affect the policing of protests.
Very important points by the Chairman of the Home Affairs Select Committee, and I had the opportunity to meet and discuss our work on this new definition with Dame Sarah and indeed with Sir Mark in preparation. And of course, I work very closely with the Home Secretary and particularly with the Minister for Security in framing the definition. As the Honourable Lady will be aware, work in the space is shared between my department and the Home Office. The Home Office, of course, deals with security and is responsible for supporting the police. we are responsible for funding community organisations and encouraging a greater degree of social cohesion and resilience. There will be further responses to some of the recommendations in that report, and indeed in Lord Walney's report, and indeed in Dame Sarah's additional report, which will be forthcoming, and I hope that I'll have the opportunity, alongside the Home Secretary, to share further detail in the weeks ahead.
Dame Priti Patel. Speaker, can I just put on record, first of all, my thanks to Dame Sarah Khan, Sir Mark Rowley and William Shawcross for all the work that they have all done, certainly during my time as Home Secretary in this important area, and of course to the Secretary of State. Now, while these proposals are non-statutory and will act as a guide for civil servants and for ministers, can the Secretary of State share and explain what evidential thresholds will be applied by the new Centre of Excellence when compiling the list of organisations and guidance, and also how this guidance will be applied against existing definitions in law of racism, incitement and intimidation, which clearly are all active right now and obviously guide our security services and our police when it comes to the application and upholding the rule of law?
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend who, during her time in the Home Office, initiated and took forward fantastic work in dealing with extremism and intolerance. And she is quite right that the definition does not impinge or alter the legal threshold for prosecution if people are inciting violence. Indeed, there are arguments for looking again at our laws to make sure that they are fit for purpose, but today's definition is not about changing the criminal law. It is about setting a threshold, and that threshold is one that will be evidenced when we come forward with those organisations that we believe meet this bar, with evidence which everyone can see makes a compelling case for the nature of the extremist ideology which spurs those organisations on.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Secretary of State, in my view, very unwisely, recently closed down the interfaith network, which facilitated the kind of dialogue which he praised in his statement, and he closed it down on the grounds that one of its 22 trustees is connected with the Muslim Council of Britain. If an organisation finds itself unjustly on the list that he proposes, will it have the opportunity to appeal against its inclusion there?
I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman, and it wasn't the case that we closed down the interfaith network. We ceased funding, and the interfaith network draws its funding from a variety of sources. But it is the case that we will apply appropriate due diligence, publish evidence, and of course, if anyone believes that our judgment is wrong, as in any case when government acts and it is believed to be unreasonable, then the option of judicial review is always available.
Robert Buckland.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome my right honourable friend's statement. Words matter, and I note in particular the definition about intentionally creating a permissive environment to deal with the harms that he rightly identifies and we all oppose. However, there are dangers in that wording. Will he issue guidance as to what that precisely means? That word intentionally is clearly important. And does he accept from me that there is a danger here that in government generally not engaging with organisations that I think he rightly identifies, that we don't inhibit the work of our security services and agencies in having to engage with elements of these organisations in order to combat extremism at an individual level?
Well, my right honourable friend makes a very, very important point, because it is the case, obviously, that our intelligence and security agencies, law enforcement actors, and indeed sometimes those working abroad to keep us safe, will have to deal with and engage with unsavoury individuals, and the definition does not cover that activity.
Imran Hussain.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And let us be clear in this House and call this what it is, Madam Deputy Speaker. What it isn't is a serious and genuine attempt to address a very important issue. What it is, Madam Deputy Speaker, is a further draconian attempt to continue with the Tory agenda of culture wars. And it's disappointing that countless civil liberties groups, including 3 of his own former Home Secretaries, have warned him against politicising such an important issue, but it seems it's fallen on deaf ears. But if the Secretary of State is serious about addressing these issues, let me ask him in this House today to firstly condemn the extremist, vile, dangerous language used by some of his own backbenchers, and to also Tory donors bankrolling his own party.
Yeah, well done. Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention, but I hope he will appreciate from the tone between the front benches that both I and the honourable lady are determined not to politicise this, but to make sure that we can operate consensually. Of course, there'll be debate and challenge and difference of opinion and emphasis in what we seek to do, but it's a shared endeavour, and indeed we've been working with independent figures like John Walney, Lord Walney, in order to achieve consensus here. And I'm sorry that he feels that it's necessary to make a party political point about my colleagues. I extend to him the same courtesy that I extend to every member of this House, respecting his mandate and respecting his voice, and not indulging in that sort of unfortunate personalisation.
Robert Jenrick. My right honourable friend has been consistent and clear-eyed about the threats that we face for a very long time, and I applaud him for that. And he himself has faced personal threats and responded with bravery and resilience, which we all admire. I fear that the definition, though well-intentioned, lands in no man's land, not going far enough to tackle the real extremists, not doing enough to protect the non-extremists, those people who are simply expressing contrarian views, who might find this definition used against them, not perhaps now, but possibly in the future. What reassurance can my right honourable friend give me and others who are concerned about that? And secondly, does he agree with me that this is not the totality of our anti-extremism strategy, important though it is? We have now to take forward other areas, in particular William Shawcroft's superb recommendations with respect to the PREVENT programme, revoking visas for those people who do not share our values, who are here as visitors, something that appears to have stalled, and ensuring that the police vigorously and fairly implement our existing laws so that everyone can have confidence that there is not and will never be two-tier policing in our country.
Well, again, I thank my right honourable friend who, when he was in the post that I currently hold, took forward immensely valuable work to counter anti-Muslim hatred and anti-Semitism and to support organisations that were fighting both. He asks, is this on its own enough? And of course he's right, it isn't. But it is a necessary step in order to respond indeed to Sir William Shawcross's independent review of PREVENT, where it was clear that the operation of PREVENT was insufficiently rigorous, no criticism of the professionals involved, but insufficiently rigorous because the definition, the rigour of it, needed to be updated, and that is what we do. Of course, he expressed a concern that this definition might be misused. I think it is much less likely that this definition could be misused than the preceding definition, which was looser and baggier and capable of many more interpretations than this much tighter definition. But of course, the proof of that will be in the way in which we set about using it and the evidence we provide to back up any judgments we make.
Joanna Cherry.
This new definition is going to require careful scrutiny for its compliance with human rights, such as the right to freedom of expression, religion and belief, etc. And in my role as chair of the Joint Committee on Human Rights, I'm delighted that we'll be taking forward that scrutiny next week. But on a personal level, can I ask the Secretary of State to agree with me that members of this House have a duty to be careful in their use of language and not to brand groups extreme or hateful simply because they disagree with them? And I want to give an example of that because it's an important and topical example. My friends at LGB Alliance, a well-respected LGBT rights charity, have been described by some members of this House as a hate group, simply because they raised the hitherto unfashionable but now vindicated concerns about the prescription of puberty blockers. So will the Secretary of State join with me in reminding members of this House of their responsibility not to use their positions to stifle legitimate debate, which makes an important contribution to our democracy?
Well, I'm really grateful to the Honourable and Learned Lady for her point. And again, I stress this is about government engagement. And while she or I might agree or disagree with an individual group, we respect their right to free speech and free association. And the points that she makes about the LGB alliance are well made. Again, it is right that there should be debate on gender and sex questions, and I commend the government for the steps that it's taken to ban puberty blockers. And therefore, I think in this debate, a degree of respect and concern for the very different and heartfelt positions that everyone holds is right. And may I say that her consistent championing of a particular position, though sometimes unpopular with others, is commendable and brave, and she represents the very best of her party.
Kit Malthouse.
Madam Speaker, I'm grateful. I share, along with many other members, some alarm at the emergence of this new definition. And I had two questions broadly for the Secretary of State. First of all, further to the point made by the member from South London, is there really to be no appeal process in this branding of particular groups as unacceptable? Not least because, as he will, I'm sure, intend, putting them on a government blacklist effectively will have a chilling impact more widely on their place in society, from financial services to the media, who is likely to engage with them. So at what stage in the process will those groups that he decides are worthy of examination be able to present evidence in their defence? And secondly, if a member of this House disagrees with the view of the Secretary of State or the government and decides to invite that group into the House or be a member of that group, will the government refuse to engage with the Member of Parliament?
Well, I'm grateful again to my right honourable friend and commend him for the work that he did in the Home Office. During his time there, he will have known that there was an already existing definition, and with that already existing definition, there was an obligation on government not to engage with certain groups. He will also know that while he was there, Sir William Shawcross pointed out that that definition needed to be updated and those engagement principles reinforced. So we're simply doing what, continuing the work that he did so diligently and effectively while at the Home Office. Organisations, I mentioned them earlier, like the British National Socialist Movement and Patriotic Alternative, are organisations which I would hope that no member of this House would want to deal with, but obviously each individual must look to their own conscience about the organisations with which they engage. This is purely about government. Parliament is, quite rightly, sovereign.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Following the point made by the member for Hampshire just now, I urge the Secretary of State to be cautious in all of this, because those of us, for example, that campaigned against apartheid in the 70s were often condemned. The ANC was never banned in Britain, but there were calls to ban it. Things change, history moves on, and those that marched for peace in Ireland were condemned at the time, and later we had the Good Friday Agreement. So I ask the Secretary of State, what is the status of the statement that he's just put before us today? Does it have legal force? Will it be an instruction to the police? Will it be an instruction to local authorities? Exactly how will it be implemented? And on page 5 of his statement, page 5 and 6, he quite rightly makes the point that we have rights of religious assembly, rights of free speech, rights of organisation. Very important to state those. All of those are enshrined in the European Convention on Human Rights. Can he assure us, because it's not mentioned anywhere in this document, that there is no plan whatsoever by the government or the Conservative Party to withdraw from the European Convention of Human Rights and therefore from the European Court of Human Rights? Because for all its failings and inefficiencies, it does underpin human rights in a very, very important way.
Well, I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman for the points that he makes, and his question gives me an opportunity to clarify that we will proceed with caution, and that this definition governs only government engagement and government funding. Other autonomous organisations must and will make their own judgments. This is simply about what government and its agencies do. And he makes the point that, again, people and organisations can change over time. That is true. There are people who have been members of extremist organisations who have changed their view and who have been invaluable in helping us to challenge the work of extremists. Those who were formerly members of Islamist organisations like Hizb ut-Tahrir have been valuable in countering that hate. Those people who were formerly members of neo-Nazi organisations have been invaluable in making sure that we can police their activities. So, of course, it is always within the human heart to have the capacity to change and to reform.
Parliamentary State.
Mr. Speaker, of course, the first duty of any state is to protect your citizens' national security. And many of us have different experiences of dealing with extremism. I've sat on the Home Affairs Select Committee previously for 3 years dealing with extremism and radicalisation in that regard. And as somebody who comes from a Muslim faith, I get 1,000 pieces of hatred from the far right. And I also get 1,000 pieces of hatred from Islamist Daesh-inspired individuals. I also have a death threat being investigated by Kent Police at the moment, like other members will have their own different experiences. I say this to the Secretary of State. This statement is being made today, after 16 months of this government, our government, not having an independent advisor to tackle Islamophobia. This statement is also being made after 2 weeks ago, the government-funded body Tell Mama published data to say there was 2,000 pieces of hate incidents or crimes against the Muslim community. And we haven't had a statement from the government at all on engagement with the Muslim community. So the question I ask the Secretary of State is this. People will be looking at this statement with that backdrop in mind, and I want him to clarify to me today, with regards to the interpretation of this definition. Am I right that it will be a minister who will be making the determination if something is intolerant, is a permissive environment, or if it's intolerant? A government minister will be making that determination. No disrespect to current government ministers or future government ministers, but giving ministers that responsibility, I think, raises real concern because it comes down to each minister's own judgment. And this matter needs to make sure that we have a thorough, independent, fair process because we are all committed to our national security.
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman who has endured the consequences of extremism himself and who's been a very valuable voice for religious freedom for many years now. He makes two important points. The need to be vigilant in dealing with anti-Muslim hatred, and that is why my right honourable colleague, the Security Minister, announced more than £100 million worth of funding in order to better protect mosques and to better protect schools and other Muslim community centres. I commend that initiative. It is also why the government continues to fund the excellent organisation Tell Mama, whose founder I had the opportunity to meet again yesterday in order to discuss the approach that we are taking. He asks, is it the case that ministers alone make the judgment? Ministers will make that judgment informed by impartial civil service advice and academic research.
John McDonnell.
For a number of years I've been meeting with and working with an organisation that published in 2018 its report, Our Shared British Future, Muslims and Integration in the UK. I supported that report because it called for equal integration to all, breaking down barriers, working towards tackling challenges, hindering integration. It called for the celebration of British diversity, celebrate the success of our model of integration, and also reported on the role of faith integration organisations in integration to recognise faith can support integration efforts. That organisation is the Muslim Council of Britain. The Secretary of State deprecated the leaks around this report. Well, the informal spin and briefings that have taken place have dragged the name of the Muslim Council of Britain through the mud in recent days. He hasn't fairly answered the question about what appeal process will be taking place apart from judicial review. Will organisations, therefore, and individuals have access to legal aid for judicial review in challenging decisions by the Secretary of State on this?
I think it was the Labour government when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister that raised concerns about some of the activities and views expressed by members of the Muslim Council of Britain, but any organisation which has concerns raised is an organisation that we will be very, very careful in scrutinising before taking any steps. And when we do take any steps, if we take any steps, the evidence will be clearly laid out.
Miriam Cates.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I absolutely support my right honourable friend's aims in making this statement in terms of protecting our democracy and protecting us from violence and threats and the kind of terrorist threats that we've seen over recent weeks. But I do share the concerns that many honourable members have made that in separating the definition of extremism from actual violence and harm, and using terms like fundamental rights, which don't actually have a definition in law, we do risk criminalising, or at the very least chilling the speech of, people who have perfectly legitimate, harmless views. And I just want to go back to the example of gender-critical feminists. So a gender-critical feminist might be intolerant of the rights of people to change their sex on their birth certificate. They might be seeking to undermine that right by seeking to repeal the Gender Recognition Act, for example. They would be labelled extremists under these regulations as I can see it. And as to impartial civil servants deciding these things, I'm afraid I just don't think that's always the case. And certainly I have seen civil servants wearing very unimpartial lanyards on this particular issue. So I just seek his reassurance that not only will these groups not be labelled extremists now, but there will be protections that they could never be labelled so in future.
Grateful to the Honourable Lady. It's precisely because I share her concerns that we've made the definition tighter. I'm sure she's aware of the already existing wording of the 2011 definition, which has a far broader range of groups which could fall within its ambit. By being more narrow, more precise and more rigorous, we more effectively protect free speech. She referred to criminalising. Let's be clear, there's nothing in this which would lead to a ban. It is simply about saying which organisations government should and should not engage with. And I'm sure she would agree with me that neo-Nazi organisations and Islamist organisations of the kind that I drew attention to are the kinds of organisations that government should not be engaging with, and it was regrettable in the past that we have.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The government's independent reviewer of terrorism, Jonathan Hall, and the government's independent adviser on anti-Semitism, Lord Mann, have both criticised what they've learned of these outline proposals for a new non-statutory definition of extremism. Jonathan Hall points out that Hizb ut-Tahrir was proscribed under the Terrorism Act for its reaction to the 7th of October attacks, quite rightly. And he said proposals would mark a shift from doing bad things to thinking bad things. Lord Mann points to contradictions between banning some speakers from universities while having just passed a law to enshrine the freedom of speech in universities. And he talks about the politics of division doing nothing to help the Jewish community. Will the Secretary of State be reflecting on the advice of the government's independent reviewer of terrorism and its independent adviser on anti-Semitism?
Well, I met them both in the preparation of the work that we've done today, and I think it was the case that the independent adviser on anti-Semitism, Lord Mann, whose work is outstanding, said on broadcast today that he regarded this as an improvement on the existing definition. So I'm grateful for that support and for the honourable gentleman's question and the opportunity for me to relay that to the House.
Sir Edward Lee.
I'm worried about this. Will my right honourable friend reassure me that nothing in this statement is going to add to the increasing culture in what should be a free country of the intolerance of the right to offend? I mean, I may be offended if people make extreme attacks on Christianity. They have an absolute right to do so, and people have a right to criticise religious people or particular religions. Equally, Orthodox Jews or devout evangelical Christians with a particular view of the Bible or devout traditional Muslims have an absolute right to say what they believe in a free society, even if it's very unfashionable.
I couldn't agree more. It's the principle of Milton's Areopagitica that govern my approach towards free speech, that ideas should contend on the plane of argument and that people should be able to discern good arguments from bad arguments. All that this statement does is to tighten the existing definition. The concerns that my right honourable friend raises about definitions being used to marginalise speech, I think existed with the previous definition to an extent. Now, with this tighter definition, and also with the fact that the government will publish the reasons why it chooses not to engage with a group, things could be clearer. And as I say, it's purely about government engagement and financing. And I know that he, like me, would want to make sure that taxpayers' money was stewarded wisely.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. This tweet was liked by Sir Paul Marshall. Civil war is coming. There has never been a country that has remained peaceful with a sizable Islamic presence. Once the Muslims get to 15 to 20% of the population, the current cold civil war will turn hot. Many other incendiary tweets were liked or retweeted by Marshall, a substantial donor to both the Tory party and the Secretary of State personally, according to a recent Hope Not Hate newsagent's investigation. How does the Secretary of State square his definition of extremism with accepting money from someone like Marshall?
Well, I deprecate the personal attack on Sir Paul Marshall, who is a distinguished philanthropist and the supporter of ARC academies, which are state schools that have done so much, including in the Honourable Gentleman's constituency, to improve the lives of disadvantaged children from a variety of minority backgrounds.
Mark Logan.
Madam Deputy Speaker, that's
last evening in the House of Commons, I attended the all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims, big iftar celebration, and one person after another said to me in private that they were fearful of an increasing mood of Islamophobia. Indeed, my friend on this side of the House had referred to the Tel Mama statistics, where since October there's been a 335% increase in anti-Muslim hatred. What I'm worried about is a slippery slope, and although I commend what the Secretary of State said today in terms of it's just looking at community engagement, but can we be assured that this is not a slippery slope in months and years ahead, which will lead to a position across the criminal law where people do not feel that they're able to speak their mind anymore? And I take the example of 2-3 weeks ago in my own constituency. I attended a rally in support of Gaza, but of course we've seen in recent months that that's almost been outlawed, or people have been silenced from doing that. So can the Secretary of State give those commitments that this will not be the commencement of a slippery slope? And I say that, again, as someone who's grew up in Northern Ireland and has grew up in an environment of terrorism, and I know that it's very easy whenever you think that you're putting one person away, that you end up with 1,000 enemies behind them.
I'm again very grateful to my honourable friend, whose experience not only in Northern Ireland but working abroad to promote peace and inclusion is to be commended. And he's quite right. It's the department which I currently lead which funds Tel Mama, which does such important work in highlighting and recording acts of anti-Muslim hatred. There's been a dreadful increase in them. We want to work with organisations on the ground to counter that hatred. It is the case, as I mentioned, that some of the organisations that have been supported in the past sadly have been extremist and have been seeking to intimidate British Muslims, and that is why we need to be careful with whom we work in order to present a united front against anti-Muslim hatred.
Lord Galloway.
Deputy Speaker, it's quite clear that there's a shared endeavour going on between the two front benches, but as questions have continued, it's quite clear there's unease on both sides of the House on the back benches, and for very good reasons. It is obviously true that this is part of a culture war wallpaper that's being created for the general election soon to come. It's not good enough to say that it doesn't seek to ban or jail anyone. You try getting a bank account once you've been branded by Michael Gove as an extremist. Now, extremism, if we were debating this in the Oxford Union, as once we did in his salad days, on another matter, we'd all be talking about what's the definition. I just remind the Secretary that a former Speaker of this House was wearing a Hang Nelson Mandela T-shirt when my right honourable friend and I were seeking the overthrow of apartheid and being called divisive. This building is designed to show that politics is full of division, and sometimes those reviled as extremists turn out to have been right all along.
Can I first of all congratulate the honourable member on his election as Member of Parliament for Rochdale? As he quite rightly points out, we have known each other for several decades, and during that time I have always admired his oratorical skills and the passion with which he makes his case. There's nothing in this definition that any honourable member should fear will inhibit them from making their case, and while I passionately disagree with the honourable gentleman on so many issues, he has the same rights as every other member of this House and deserves to be listened to with respect as he makes his case.
Sir Desmond Sway.
I stated that a free society requires that the Muslim religion accommodate itself to the same level of scrutiny, criticism, even blasphemy, as Christianity has become accustomed to. Am I straying into his permissive environment? I'm not an extremist, am I?
My right honourable friend is many, many things. Learned, wise, kind, a champion of the New Forest, and a distinguished former educationist. He is not an extremist, and the rigour with which he prosecutes his case is one I will continue to admire.
John Cryer.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I share my right honourable friend's concern that government departments may have been engaging with extremists and racists in the past. Now, the Secretary of State seemed to indicate that this engagement or lack of engagement is dependent on the definition. Isn't it also dependent on the common sense of ministers? And if ministers are willing to engage with extremists and racists, surely they shouldn't be ministers in the first place.
I absolutely take his point, and the key thing here is that sometimes there are organisations that seek to operate, as I mentioned, and individuals that seek to operate by presenting one face to one group and a different face to another, and that is why we need appropriate due diligence. Mistakes have been made in the past. I think those mistakes were made in good faith and unwittingly. But as has been pointed out, across this House, a number of people have expressed their concern about those past errors. That is why I think we need a tighter and more precise definition.
Andrew Rosendale.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I commend the Government on what they are attempting to do to oppose and fight all forms of extremism and hatred in our country. But will he agree with me that what underpins Britain is our ancient liberties and freedoms, free speech, the rule of law, upholding our democracy under the Crown? And does he believe, as I do, that we must defend all of our British values and traditions, we must teach them in schools, and we must ensure that British values are the order of the day?
Well, my honourable friend makes a very, very important point. And I do think it is the case that in our schools and in other institutions we should make sure that people from every background are acquainted with our history and taught the very British habits of scepticism and questioning, and sometimes raucous expressions of opposition to governments and others. That spirit of democratic challenge is core to this country, and no one better exemplifies being able to speak out without fear or favour than my honourable friend.
Hannah.
The press release attached to this statement, deliberately or otherwise, by reference to the period since the 7th of October, does seem to imply that protests and other human responses to the horrors of Hamas's attacks on Israel and the bombardment of Gaza are extreme. In my diverse and shared South Belfast constituency, we are battling extremism at the moment in the form of a rash of menacing and racist posters about foreigners and housing, and it is my genuine belief that that rhetoric is being fanned by this government, a government of a party who are funded by a person who says that they hate all black women. It is worth mentioning that the Northern Ireland office ministers met with representative paramilitaries during their negotiations on the withdrawal agreement. Politics like this and the departure from pluralism and tolerance are part of the reason why I and many others advocate a new Ireland by exclusively peaceful and democratic means. That would, of course, undermine and change the constitution of the United Kingdom and its democracy. Can the Minister confirm that people like me who advocate a new Ireland are not extremists under the second part of his definition?
No, of course not. The SDLP has a long and proud tradition of arguing for Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland to become a new state, and that has, as I say, an impeccable political tradition. It is the case, of course, that, as she quite rightly points out, there are many people who wish to protest about what is happening in the Middle East. We may disagree about aspects of that conflict, but a sincere desire to bring peace to the Middle East is one I hope that we all share, and the regrettable incidence of prejudice in the streets of South Belfast is one that we all deprecate.
James Sunderland.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I welcomed a clear statement today, and it is right that we openly debate and tackle extremism in this place. At this time of tension and sensitivity, does the Secretary of State agree with me that politicians do have a responsibility to dial down the rhetoric, that divisions must not be exploited for political gain, and that we all just need to work together across the House to achieve it?
I couldn't agree more with my honourable friend, and his distinguished career of public service, even before he entered this House, has shown a commitment to working across divides in order to strengthen our democracy.
Deputy Speaker, he spoke of sharing workings about affected organisations. He didn't share workings after the abrupt decision he took to pull government funding from the Interfaith Network, causing that respected organisation to close. How does he explain that contradiction between his words and his recent actions?
A letter was published outlining the reasoning behind that, and the government is only one of a number of funders of the Interfaith Network.
Tom Hunt.
Deputy Speaker, I don't want to be accused of dialling up
the rhetoric. But I must say, I and millions of people in this country are utterly fed up of these protests which have been taking place in our nation's capital. Not every person who attends these protests are an extremist. Not every person who attends it are radicals, but many are. And they are going unchallenged. I've got Jewish friends who won't go into their own capital because they don't feel safe, and it's weekend after weekend after weekend. When is something going to happen? All the public see is impotence. And it is fuelling extremism. It is linked to that debate. And frankly, if it doesn't get any better, and we continue to see hate on our streets unchallenged, will the government be prepared to strip responsibility for policing in London from the Mayor of London and give a far stronger steer to the Metropolitan Police, who every weekend, from what I can see, are failing to stand up for our values and for Jewish people to feel safe?
Well, my honourable friend speaks passionately about this, and I know myself from talking to Jewish friends that they do consider some of the statements and actions that accompany these marches to cause them to feel a profound sense of fear, and that's been well recorded by not just the government's Commission for Countering Extremism, but by members of this House. So I do share the concern that he has for the Jewish community. I should say that the Metropolitan Police Commissioner takes his responsibilities very seriously, and there have been a number of arrests alongside these marches, and individuals have been prosecuted for incitement and for hateful actions. I would also say that my colleagues in the Home Office have commissioned a report from Lord Walney, John Woodcock, as was, looking at how we effectively give the police all the powers they need, and we will be coming forward in due course with a response to that report.
Bishop Bergen.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm afraid that the statement has not assuaged the fears that so many have about what the government is really up to here. Given recent events on which the Secretary of State was remarkably silent in his actual statement, can I ask, shouldn't someone saying an MP should be shot count as extremist, or are those who have donated £10 million to the Conservative Party exempted from such definitions? And wouldn't the Tory party be better off getting its own house in order rather than making this clearly political intervention, which is more about the upcoming general election and the attempt to silence the huge numbers of peaceful opponents of the government's Gaza policy than it does with public safety?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, as someone who was the victim of a determined effort to, kill me, and because the individual who was trying to kill me then went on to kill a friend and colleague in this House, I take incredibly seriously threats of violence. And the member for Hackney North and Stoke Newington is someone whom I've long admired, and those comments were disgusting. I absolutely no hesitation in stating that. But the intention of bringing forward this definition today is to make sure that government and government alone ensures that it works with organisations committed to peace and committed to greater social cohesion. And I hope that, on reflection, he will recognise that we can work together in order to deal with those hateful extremists whose actions we both, I'm sure, deprecate.
Anna.
Mr Deputy Speaker, my right honourable friend will understand that the people of Southend West will welcome his statement and appreciate his commitment to tackling extremism. But they also know that the devil is not just in the detail, but in the enforcement. And they have seen their Parliament with anti-Semitic slogans from the river to the sea projected on it, which, if are not already against the law, certainly should be, and they've seen the police take insufficient action. We've also had anti-Middle East war marches in Southend with fake dolls covered in white bandages spattered with red substance, with placards around saying Anna Firth kills babies. Now, both of those actions are clearly, I would say, if they're not extreme, they are very close to being within his definition of extremism. So can he assure me and this House that we will make sure that the message as to what is extremism and what is against the law gets through to the police and the appropriate action is taken?
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely correct to draw attention to the fact that there have been occasions recently when people motivated to make a particular point have crossed a threshold, and I know that the police take these transgressions incredibly seriously, as does my right honourable friend, the Security Minister and the Home Secretary.
Santari.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Over the past week, as we've sort of meandered towards this statement, much of it played out in the press, definitions and various organisations potentially being named as being prescribed. I'm wondering how my constituents in Ilford South can have any faith in the Secretary of State to decide who is or isn't an extremist. And the reason I ask that question is because it's also been briefed that his preferred appointment as the anti-Muslim hatred advisor is Haras Rafiq. And Mr Deputy Speaker, this is the former CEO of the Quilliam Foundation, which worked with US anti-Muslim think tanks and promoted the favourite theory of Nick Griffin, the Great Replacement theory, a conspiracy theory that is so far debunked to an extreme, it should be nowhere near the Secretary of State's thinking. And yesterday, and most damningly, Tommy Robinson, a far-right extremist that everyone in this House knows who he is, actually praised that appointment. So, Secretary of State, how can my constituents have faith that the decisions you will be making are not actually politicised?
Because we will publish the evidence behind them.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I warmly welcome this statement today. But there is one issue that we have to look at, and that is that organisations are populated by individuals. Those individuals will have these hate-filled views and may either be expelled by those organisations or alternatively go off and form other organisations that won't be on the banned list. Equally, as the Right Honourable Lady opposite raised during her point, it is individuals that seek to radicalise young people, either from abroad or in the UK. So what action is my right honourable friend going to be taking to ensure that foreign nationals who seek to radicalise our young people are prevented from doing so?
Well, my honourable friend makes a very good point, and indeed it was a point that was made in a related way by my right honourable friend, the member for Newark. And it is the case, I know, that the Home Office is vigilant about who it allows to come here and conducts appropriate work in order to ensure that visas are not granted to people who are here to disseminate or sow division and hate.
Stuart Hosey.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. We know from the work of the ISC under the leadership of the Secretary's right honourable friend from New Forest East in the report on extreme right-wing terrorism that there are a number of people who are radicalised not simply by shadowy organisations or the dark web, but in part at least by the mainstream media. So how does the Secretary of State see his statement today and his definition of the creation of a permissive environment? I'm thinking judges, enemies of the people. How does he see his statement today and the definitions intersecting with the mainstream media?
Well, I think that all of us have a responsibility to be vigilant about the dangers of extremism, and I'm grateful to many media outlets for shining a light on extremism, from the BBC to the Times newspaper. I know he mentions one particular newspaper headline. He may disagree with it or find it objectionable, but I think the most important thing to recognise is that a vigorous culture of free speech sustained by a free and independent press is a critical part of our democratic culture.
I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for his statement today and for responding to questions for an hour and 13 minutes. Thank you very much. We're now going to move on.